Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to review It 2017 or It Chapter 1, however you want to break this down, so that way it's different from the original It movie. So going into this, like remembering the original now coming to here, where like the original they kind of split it up, where they'd have this like certain portion of movie where it's the kid version, and then a certain portion where it's the adult version. In this movie, they did the whole thing being the kids, and then of course the sequel had the adults come back very much later and have to then deal with Pennywise yet again. I guess probably spoiling the fact that like there is like a lot of people know that there's a sequel of this movie, so I don't think it'll be spoiling that this Pennywise character will forcibly come back again. I think that's not a surprise to anybody. Um, but yeah, so I could say that I could kind of enjoy this film. Just kind of how like some characters are like kind of the character Ben is to just be kind of interesting to me, where he kind of really studies the lore of this town, and I could really enjoy that character. Um, Really, I honestly would say that here's the thing that kind of just isn't that good about this movie. Like, I have watched this movie twice now, and I honestly think while watching the very first movie, like, I was really hooked, and I was really just like, what's gonna happen here? And, like, I was really just kind of like, man, this seems like a very much surprise, and, like, if anything, I guess I can understand first time around people could probably get scared, very uneasy, or very uncomfortable during this film, and so on and so forth. Um, and that's probably how I would have reviewed this the first time around, to just say like, yeah, this is a really uneasy movie, it's unnerving, it's unhinging, some people might just get scared during it, and that's perfectly okay. um I kind of went into this movie just going, like, we're here again. Like, we're here watching this movie. um like like I could probably enjoy little things that they did, um, like little effects and stuff like that, that got into like separating every little kid with their own little fear. Like, I can really understand that, and I can enjoy those little pieces and stuff along those ways. But uh, yeah, it just comes off as like a one-off movie to eventually just want to like, okay, let's go to the sequel and see what's going on there, and because that's going to be a much more bigger budget movie to be put together. But yeah, like, so I could say that there is some enjoyment in this film, but I also can feel like, man, this is like a long stretch of a movie too. Like, we really have to like showcase like not only the each individual fear of each person, we also have to kind of go through like, hey, let's try to like have little like snippets of story for each member of this group to really like stretch parts of this out to just give us more of Derry or the understanding of this town. Here's the thing. So eventually Ben is to realize that supposedly every 27 some odd years, it seems that this it character is to come to the fold, and a lot of people are to supposedly vanish or disappear or whichever. And like, supposedly in one time period there had been like 91 people who had supposedly vanished. And I was like, is it all of a sudden that like immediately once you saw those kind of pieces and you saw this kind of play out, I'm like, are they eventually just gonna go and try to do like prequels of this movie to desperately try and like continue on with this franchise, to naturally just go, oh, okay, well, I think at chapter two, like, they really did beat it, so now we have to go to prequels and just show those parts, and then maybe we'll get back to the more current. Like, I was assuming or assessing there was going to be like 30 of these It movies, where we would just have every 27 some odd years that this Pennywise would eventually continue to come back. And so I was expecting there to be like 10 movies out of this whole thing, but I guess they just decided to just do two. Or so we thought. Maybe there's going to eventually be more. When eventually, like, Warner Brothers is like, dude, we need to just dust off something. Um, Plus, also, people just enjoyed Pennywise. People, I think, much more hung on to these movies than I guess the one original film. I guess, just because the visual of the character, uh, the way that this movie like just looked just visually interesting from parts. Adding in the whole balloon was kind of an interesting thing in this movie, and that's what started to get a lot of like video games and stuff like that to use like balloons as some kind of like supernatural like thing. I kind of wish that they would have honestly used that a lot more often, but I think a lot of people would probably complain about that. Just be like, okay, so like they're always using balloons now. Like, what the heck is that? But I think like the whole balloon thing was during a certain time period, but like it would just be interesting to have like kept plugging at that or just kind of using that. And but a lot of people are just like, oh, that's a Pennywise thing. They're stealing off of that. F those people from doing that. But yeah, because I know a lot of people would have that like strong thing of just like, uh, and maybe it too was also like just like going and like, dude, we're gonna copy freaking, we're gonna trademark or something like the whole balloon thing used in movies or some if someone else is gonna use it, we're gonna freaking like sue them or go after them. But anyways, you would have thought that would have been like a smart strategy, but whatever. So, but yeah, so I would say that I could like the story. I could enjoy the story. Like I feel like there's a good movie here, a really enjoyable movie. Um like I wouldn't go out of my way to say that it's a like I wouldn't say that it's a great film, but I would say that it's a real hard like good movie that uh like almost gets into great territory just because of how much it does like do things that I enjoy called creepiness. I love the fact that we have this movie that like feels creepy, but like to me I just thought that this movie was just slow. Like it was just so like slow. I'm like, come on, like there was a lot of the scares that had to be milked out. Obviously, there was just a lot of points where I'm just kind of like, come on, like get in your face more about it, and they just kind of had to like slow these things out, and I just kind of got bored during those spots where I'm just like, dude, the part that you're supposed to scare the crap out of me, I want it to be kind of in your face through, and no, there's this slow build of scare. And I think the very first time around when I was to watch this, I mentioned that a lot of the scares that I got, that I felt that I was gonna get from this movie, because I wasn't actually scared, I was just uncomfortable during it. I felt like a lot of this stuff had to deal with sound in this movie. Like a lot of the scares had to do this like cheap sound thing that kind of gave you much more uneasy vibe than anything else. Like I think I complained about how cheap the scares was when I originally reviewed this. And like I think I still have that, but if anything, like I don't think that I had the volume as loud as I did. I think the original time, just because I was trying to like figure out like every little bit of piece of dialogue and whatever. So, but yeah, so that's all that I have to say about it 2017. As far as cryptic sense goes, I think it's about time to go into spoiler sense of this film. Um, I don't know, like even my grading system, like I feel like I'm not giving this movie enough credit. Like cuz I feel like it's, let's go with like a flimsy great film. Let's go with that just because a solid good film going into greatness, but like it's just like to me I'm like it's a one-off movie to me. And so that's kind of how like weak it feels. That I go into this and I'm just like, there's a lot of cool things that they do with the characters when they're individually, but once you kind of plop them into a group together, that's when the story just is like, God, I hate these parts. Like, let's get to the individual parts that are scary or just much more interesting when eventually these people are together in a group. Because once they're together in a group, I'm just like, God, this sucks. This movie sucks. This part sucks. So, speaking of suck, let's suck our way into going into spoilers. Let's go into it because it's about that time yet again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time to spoil this movie. So, and I apologize. I took like 10 minutes, but I don't know. There's probably a lot of rambling around. So, spoilers. So really, the very beginning of this is to kind of like set up the kids where like besides like setting up Bill in the very early part of this movie. So Bill is to, I guess, be sick, and so Georgie is to want to go out and play in the rain of all things. I'm like, does that sound stupid to anybody else? Like, you can catch pneumonia. Do you want to catch that, Georgie? But I guess it's just like, well, it's going to be the only one time that Georgie is going to be able to like have like this paper-ish like boat that has like golf wax on it, that like he's going to be able to kind of like play in the road with this boat. And yeah, so Georgie is to ask Bill if he wants to go out and play, but Bill is sick at the time. So Georgie goes out and eventually is to play with this little paper boat that, again, he had to have wax be put on it so it can float, or otherwise it probably would have just crumpled up into the water or whatever, because like it's pouring down rain and so on and so forth. So, which of course the rain was fake. Like, come on, like don't pull the wool over my eyes and think that it's like give me the impression that it's really raining in this movie. Come on, like I know that was fake rain. Don't pull the wool over my eyes. So Georgie is to eventually lose said boat, and so Georgie's like, "Oh, Bill's gonna like hurt me because like I lost his boat." Like, dude, this is a paper boat. How easy would it be to make a bajillion of these things? And so this kid could have just walked off and just be like, ah, that sucks. Like, nah, like I'm just gonna go back in and just have a good time, just playing with actual toys that I probably have in my room because that's normally the common thing. Um, but yeah, so all of a sudden Georgie is to eventually like see that this boat has gone down the drain of the sewer, and so Georgie is to kind of like almost kind of put his hand in there to try to see if he can find it, but then eventually he ends up pulling away when we see Pennywise, who is in the drain. And so we have Georgie pulling his hand back out, and he's just like, well, hey, like, hey, clown that's bizarrely in a sewer that wouldn't put up any red flags in my mind. Like, just be like, you know what? I'm just gonna get the heck out of here. I'll see you later, clown. That has to bizarrely like have my boat in your hand, and is also a clown that's bizarrely in the sewer, like as if like this guy is from the Penguin gang from Batman. So Georgie is to ask this clown like how exactly that this clown is now in the sewer, and we have Pennywise who is mentioning that the whole entire circus is down into the sewer, and that Georgie should come down so that way he can get all kinds of fun little treat things like cotton candy and popcorn and all this kind of stuff, like teasing him, I guess, with sweets or something that he would probably definitely want, which is a horrible thing to do. So, but also, Pennywise is also tempting Georgie with, of course, like, hey, do you want this boat? Like, I'll give it to you. Like, you'll float too, mother. So Georgie is just like, well, okay, like I would definitely like to get this boat back, and so Georgie eventually goes and tries to get the boat from Pennywise, but that just ends up with Georgie losing an arm, and then him just getting sucked down the sewer because he's a little small kid who like made a mistake because like he obviously should have just walked away. But evidently he didn't know about stranger danger or like if there's a person in the sewer, maybe you shouldn't talk to him. Seems kind of a no brainer, right? Or that reasonably, like, if any person is going to offer you some kind of candy or something, like, probably shouldn't go down a sewer to just go and get that. That seems like a weird proposition there. But I just Georgie just wanted his boat and didn't realize that this clown was eventually going to have this like monsterish thing in its mouth to just like rip into Georgie's arm to have it cut off. And so, but Georgie just gets sucked down the sewer because what a mistake he made. And so that eventually leads us to have Bill eventually like for years Bill has just been like trying to figure out if Georgie somehow is still alive in this sewer drain, and that eventually maybe he got to some point in the sewer drain where eventually he was to get out somewhere and still be alive, or maybe he's stuck somewhere in the sewer, and so Bill's father is just like, let it go. Like, Georgie is dead. Like, we need to move on. Like, we all need a close. Like, we need to all like just have a closure moment. Just say that Georgie is sadly enough dead. We need to all move on. Because it seems like Bill's father is to have worked on the sewer lines, and so eventually Bill just kind of commandeered and was trying to think of that, like Georgie might have gotten out safely somehow. But it's like, hey man, Georgie's dead. It's been too long. So eventually we start to trickle and eventually start telling other people's stories, but let's finish up Bill's. So eventually it seems like the school year is over. That eventually we have the summer of Pennywise coming up. The summer of Pennywise. Isn't that great? Evidently we have Ben, who is to have only been called the new kid, because no one cared. Because, like, hey, new kid, we don't care if your name's Ben or not. You're new kid, because, who cares? Like, unless another new kid comes in. Except that's really just what happens. Like, a lot of times when you are the new kid, like, you could be, like, the biggest guy, or you could be the weirdest looking guy, or weirdest looking woman, or whatever. Whatever floats your boat. Eventually you'll just get called the new kid for whatever reason until eventually people are just like they finally learn what your name is because they just have the time to eventually just say, oh yeah, like the easiest name in the world to remember. Like, yeah, like it's not Snipolotopoulos. That's not my name. So going into here, so eventually what ends up happening is a girl named Beverly ends up bumping into Ben, and she ends up finding out like kind of what music Ben is listening to, and evidently he's listening to New Kids on the Block. And Beverly is just like, oh, you're listening to New Kids on the Block because you're technically the new kid on the block. But also, like, we're like kind of questioning it's like how heavily Ben does like New Kids on the Block, because eventually he has like a poster of him in his room and all kinds of things. So we're just like, okay, how much does this kid just really like New Kids? Like, I could get that more than likely it's just a certain kind of trend of that year that they have to really just showcase to show when this year of movie was done. But anyways, so Beverly eventually signs Ben's yearbook, and because Ben, like, here's a sad thing about a lot of these characters. So, So we have Ben that absolutely no one signs his yearbook because I guess everyone hated him weirdly. Dude, like, here's the thing, like, even if you're probably the most hated person in school, like, there'll probably be at least somebody who's just like, hey man, let me sign your yearbook. Even though, like, I barely knew who you were. like, like, that's the whole thing. Like, you would just get tons and tons of people that eventually, once they spot that you have a yearbook, they'd be like, dude, let me sign it. Like, hey man, like, let me put my 2 cents onto your book for whatever reason. Like, that's always the thing. And then we just have one girl that just signs this guy's yearbook. Um, but yeah, so a lot of times, bizarrely, they would have like phone numbers on yearbooks too, where like it feels like you're gonna hit them up after like high school is over, but you're just not, just uh because you're just like, yeah, like I bet like they were just like, man, I can't wait to just have him call me. That's the sad part. No, like people just bizarrely put down phone numbers for whatever reason, and then probably when you call them, like, yeah, this isn't so and so's place. Why did you even call here? I don't know. Somebody just put a number on my yearbook. But anyways, so pushing on. So eventually, Bill is to bump into the town bully. It seems because there seems to be these three kids that are being bullies in this entire film, and so that leads to having this kid who is called Henry, who is just to be the bully of seemingly all of these kids, because I guess they couldn't have like hired any other bullies in this movie. They couldn't have gotten really creative with it. They couldn't have had like 30 different bullies that are just all coming on and coming in like all at one at a time. And just be like, oh, here's the West Wing bully, and here's the. Anyways, I'm going too far into this. So, eventually, Bill is to give Henry crap, and Henry is to mention it's like, well, hey, like, I gave you kind of like a reprieve just because, like, if anything, because of your brother. But you know what? Like, but school is out, so without a doubt, like, you're not going to get off out of this. So, we have Bill, who is to just kind of suffer like a wedgie or something. Who cares? But, uh, eventually what also ends up happening is Ben is to also to get the worst possible thing done to him, just because a lot of guys were just heckling this guy because of the way that this kid's body is. Where uh, eventually they go and Henry is to kind of like back this kid into a corner, hold him down, and carve an H into his stomach, just so that way this kid will remember forever that Henry at one point in time bullied him. And so eventually, luckily, what ends up happening is Ben ends up kind of like flipping over this one like beam or whatever that he's being held against, and like slides down this one hill, and then eventually all the bullies start to chase after him, but Henry ends up losing his knife and has to desperately like try to figure out where it is because his father will kill him if he doesn't have his blade. So eventually what ends up happening is Ben is to conveniently go right around where this sewer is, right about when the same time that that all the other kids are deciding to go into the sewer to go and try to find if Georgie is in this in this sewer system after all. We also get this one spot where eventually we have a kid named Mike who is to, I guess, go and have this one weapon that looks like a gun somewhat. And this weapon, I guess, is to eventually just like quickly kill a lot of animals that are eventually to probably be set off to the butcher. So Mike is to have a hard time at first pulling the trigger on this whole thing. Uh, and so, like, his father is like, come on, Mike, do it. Do it, Mike. And he's just having a hard time pulling the trigger on an animal. So, but eventually Mike grows into it, eventually is to, like, go on and be a part of this, uh, like, job that his father is just handing him off to do. And Mike will be the only one who is to, like, stay in Derry after this whole thing is to be done, after this chapter 1. Everyone else leaves Derry and forgets all about the whole Pennywise thing, and then Mike will have to remind them about the whole situation. But so but eventually what ends up happening is, so all the group ends up deciding to all go down uh, into this train, because eventually what all happens is, like, uh, they eventually go and get Ben, like, these like this bandage or whatever, so that way he'll stop bleeding out. And eventually they all decide to go swimming together, and Beverly appears to eventually just kind of, like, go and swim with all these guys, and all the guys are looking at Beverly, like, in her underwear, and they're like, oh my god, like, man, this girl looks hot. So eventually when Beverly is to, I think that she doesn't end up going in the sewer with them, but, like, we have the group starting to go through the sewer, and of course we have Eddie, who is to be this kid who is just like scared of everything because his mother had forced him to be, where, like, Eddie is mentioning about all the allergies and stuff that he has, which he doesn't really have, but his mother is just to scare him into the point of him not really doing anything with his life, just because he has to be worried about some allergy or some kind of something that eventually is going to get him for whatever reason. So Eddie is going, like, we start to have some of these kids start to go through the sewer to try to look for Georgie, because eventually they end up seeing his shoe. And so eventually what ends up happening is we end up getting one of the bullies who was with Henry going off, and I don't know if it was not quite sure which bully it was. I don't know if it was Victor or if it was Patrick. I think it was Patrick. Let me pause here for a second. Just to be safe, let's say Henry's bully. So, one of Henry's bullies goes down to the drain trying to look for Ben, because he naturally assumes that Ben went down this drain. And that all of a sudden lends us to eventually having a balloon come up, and eventually Ben's bully is to eventually get killed by Pennywise, to really just say, like, okay, this kid is just not going to, like, this one's not going to be important, and he's going to get killed right away. He's not going to get scared. He's just going to get killed. So, and eventually once this balloon pops, eventually the Pennywise ends up coming out and killing this bully. So, we push on. So eventually what happens is Henry is to consistently bump into Mike and almost runs him over in the beginning of this movie. And so Mike is to all of a sudden kind of be scared of his father's shop, to the point of eventually Mike seeing, like, all these hands coming out of the front of this like shop of his. They end up the monsters ends up opening the door, to all of a sudden having like Pennywise just kind of hanging on this chain, and then all of a sudden like Pennywise just kind of gets up and then just kind of like unhooks himself and is to start to almost come after Mike, but eventually Pennywise just disappears. So eventually what ends up happening when, like, after the adventure of the drain, how they like try to like think about maybe going into the drain and so on and so forth. So let's separate these people and eventually get to the point of getting their individual like scares. So uh so eventually what happens to Ben is Ben decides for this whole entire summer that he wants to go to the library to research this town. And eventually he ends up finding these interesting stories where a lot of people had vanished, like 91 some odd people had vanished at one point. And so Ben starts doing heavily amounts of research of just like these crimes or these unsolved things or just these bizarre stories that just seems odd for this town. So eventually what ends up happening is Ben is to eventually go down into the further parts of this library, and because eventually he starts looking through these books and starts researching things and seeing these pictures and so on and so forth. So Ben goes down to the bottom part of this library, this bottom section, and is to all of a sudden like see something walking down the steps, and all of a sudden we end up seeing a headless person with all these Easter eggs in their hand. All of a sudden this thing starts dropping the eggs, and then all of a sudden we start actually seeing that once this headless thing is to grow a head, we find out that it's Pennywise that is chasing after Ben. But eventually Ben smacks into the librarian, and that's when the Pennywise character is just to vanish. So Beverly. Beverly is to eventually have this like weird or just kind of like sad relationship with her father. I say sad because it seems like her father is trying to take control of her, or just trying to like say like, oh, like you're my daughter, right? To where we kind of maybe could assess that Beverly's father is to like abuse her or some other kind of thing, which just seems wrong. Of course. So eventually we just keep having these times where like Beverly's father is to grab Beverly by the hand and saying like, well, you're my girl, right? You'll always be my girl, right? To where Beverly is just like, let go of my hand. Like no, like stop. So eventually to where Beverly is to try to like push her father off, and then her father is to like jump on top of her and like eventually like hit her or any number of things, sadly enough. So to where towards the end of this movie Beverly decides that she wants to just move away from her father and eventually just go and live with other family members. So but eventually what ends up happening is Beverly is to eventually like start to hear voices of things from her sink, because Beverly is to chop off her hair to have it be much shorter, because if anything her father liked her long hair, and now that Beverly cut her hair short it made her look like a boy, and so like her father liked her hair long, but she ended up cutting her hair short to defy her father. So Beverly is to eventually go and eventually look into the sink to just kind of and eventually like take a tape measure and put it down the sink to just kind of like be like, okay, how long is this drain? And she ends up taking the whole entire like measuring tape and putting it all the way down there, and then she like tries to retrieve it all, and eventually there's one spot of like blood, and so all of a sudden we have the very end of this measuring tape having some hair at the bottom of it. It's like, ew! freaking gross. So all of a sudden we start to see Beverly, who ends up getting attacked by this hair. I'm like, gross. That's so gross. Even though how many times that I've seen this, it's still freaking gross. Like a freaking gross hair coming from the sink. That's freaking nasty. So Beverly is getting attacked by this hair. She's like getting pulled back and forth by the hair. She's like, no, I'm getting pulled. So eventually, all of a sudden, there's like blood coming from the sink, and it's like splodooing everywhere. Splodooing is not even a word, but I said like there's a big impact of blood that is coming all over this, like all over the walls, all over the sink, all over everywhere. It's like a room full of blood, and so eventually Beverly is to force all of her friends to help her clean this bathroom. Now we're just like, no, I'm sorry, no. Like, you can go and clean your bloody bathroom in your own time. I'm gonna just be like, no. You know what? Just, how about a no? So, so eventually what ends up happening is that, we have Stanley, who is to be studying his what is the best way to say this? This Stanley is to eventually become a man, and so he is reading his Hebrew book to try to study the Jewish language, so that way he can be able to become a man. And it seems that his father is the priest of this whole thing. So, like, it's kind of interesting how his father is just like, seriously, you can't get this right? Like, for how I'm actually the priest of this place? Like, how you're having difficulties? Like, but we have this kid who is trying to, like, get all this down, but it's really difficult, and I'm sure, like, it would be for, like, anybody. Like, I know there's some people that actually like had to do this, and they thought it was like, man, this is like very difficult. So eventually what ends up happening is this kid is to put his book back to eventually be in this office where Stanley is to be weirdly afraid of this one painting. And so like Stanley is just kind of going like this, like, no, I don't want to see this weird painting that my dad bizarrely has in his office for whatever freaking reason. So what eventually ends up happening is Stanley is to eventually go in this room, and eventually this painting is to be coming out of the painting and is to try to scare Stanley into freaking leaving the heck out of that room for sure. So eventually Eddie is to go out of go out and start walking down the street, and all of a sudden he is to see this one creepy abandoned house that looks like a haunted house of sorts. Obviously how it looks kind of just disheveled and just like looks like crap. And so Eddie is just like, I'm walking down the road dropping all of my medication onto the ground because I need to take my pills for whatever reason. And so all of a sudden, we have this very just heavily deformed giant of a man who is to help Eddie go and pick up some of his pills and ask Eddie, like, hey, will this help me? Like, as you're to see this kind of deformed man that is just to be like the ugliest looking thing. Eddie is to try to scramble and run away from it as it's kind of like just hobbling away. And so all of a sudden we just start seeing Eddie, who ends up falling over, to eventually just seeing Pennywise with just a bunch of balloons that all eventually pop. And then eventually this whole Pennywise thing is to eventually just vanish. So Eddie is to just run away like heck from this. So eventually Mike is to get into the midst of bumping into Henry and his gang yet again, and eventually Pennywise is kind of behind these guys and just kind of like, hey, like he has bizarrely this hand that he's kind of waving around. I guess that's supposedly Georgie's hand that he's waving around, which I think that is kind of the spot that eventually the group eventually goes and like Mike becomes their friend after this spot, where eventually the rest of the group get together and toss rocks uh, at Henry, and they have this like rock fighting thing where they're consistently throwing rocks at one another for whatever reason, and like eventually that leads to them just kind of like running off together, and I don't know, it's whatever scene. What was Richie scared of? What was his individual scene? I don't remember what it was. I'm trying to figure out what the heck Eddie's scene was out of everybody. Like I think his individual scene, like I think came when they went into that haunted house. Because I think for like him, like once they all decided to go into that haunted house and to fight and to face Pennywise, because eventually once the whole group gets together, I think after that whole rock moment, eventually that's when Bill is to confess what he had seen. Because eventually Bill is to go down to his basement, and I remember when Bill told Georgie to go and get the golf wax. Georgie was kind of scared because he's like, the basement? Ugh, like I don't want to go down there. But eventually Georgie gets the golf wax and goes back up into Bill. And so eventually Bill goes down to the basement, and eventually we have Georgie, who is to eventually just kind of like talk to Bill, and Bill is just kind of talking to Georgie and having this like moment of like, oh yeah, I'm sorry that you're gone and everything like that. But eventually Georgie is like, oh, you'll float too, you'll float too, you'll float too. And then so all of a sudden we eventually just see that Pennywise is using Georgie as a puppet, and then Georgie goes splashing into the water, and then Pennywise just starts running after Bill, and eventually Pennywise smacks into the thing of stairs, and Bill gets away. And so when this group finally like gets together, Bill is to confess what he had seen in his basement, that this clown is just kind of coming after everybody, and everyone confesses what they all saw. And so Bill decides that they need to go into this haunted house that it seems that Eddie had seen this character be in, and they have to like face their fear. They have to face this Pennywise, and it seems like they didn't come in there with really a legitimate weapon of any kind, or like they're just like, hey man, we just have to go in there and like think that this clown is going to be in here and take it down. Well, they didn't really think it through. But yeah, they also had this one spot where they are to eventually go and like get this projector to look at all these like past photos and like see all these things. And eventually we have Pennywise, who eventually like uses this projector to start to scare them, to eventually see this one photo, this person with hair, and then all of a sudden we see like Pennywise kind of poking out of this thing with the hair. And then eventually Pennywise gets closer and closer into the projector's like photo, and then all of a sudden we see like Pennywise actually there, just starting to attack a lot of the kids, and then it's like, whoa! Like I guess, like I think when I originally saw this, I think that was the only part where I was just like, okay, something's gonna happen here because this is a slow trickle of things, but I think like something's gonna happen here, and I thought like probably out of all the spots in this movie, this was like the scariest spot, I guess. So Pennywise comes out and like is this big gigantic of a thing, and starts just attacking the kids and just knocking them all out. And so eventually right after that they decide, you know what, enough is enough, let's go to Pennywise's home and just try to attack him, just try to like face this Pennywise, because we have to take this down or it's just never going to stop. So eventually what they end up going to this house and doing is to just try to like face this thing, and eventually they end up like grabbing random pieces and attacking Pennywise with these random pieces. And so while that's going on, let me pause here for a reset. All right. So eventually when we get to this abandoned home or this abandoned house, that's where things start to really amp up, or really start to get really cool. I enjoy the moment where eventually one of the kids is taking this like metal piece, ramming it through like Pennywise's like face to where like you just see his face like really distorted and really ugly, and a lot of the kids are like, ugh, like this looks so gross. But eventually that just leads to Pennywise using that to his advantage. So eventually when we get into this one spot, there to be like two kids who end up heading into this one room where it's to say like not scary at all, or like really scary or whatever, like these three doors. So eventually they try to figure out which is the best door to do, and really there is no answer. Like they eventually decide, but eventually it's a mistake either way. But so Richie is to eventually go and see a paper in this house that is to eventually showcase that supposedly he has gone missing, that he's 11 years old, and like it's his picture and everything like that, and that is to start to creep Richie out. And so eventually Richie is to go into this room like filled with clowns, and eventually he ends up going and opening this coffin that is supposed to be like a replica of him in it. And so eventually it just has like his poster of his missing sign and says found. And so all of a sudden we have Richie, who ends up closing the door, to have it come flying out of it and dropping onto the top of this coffin, and is trying to come after Richie. So eventually what ends up happening is like these guys are caught off guard. Eventually we have Eddie, who ends up kind of like falling through one floor, ends up smacking onto this one table and breaking his arm. Or eventually we'll see the arm brace that ends up saying loser on it, and he ends up adjusting it to say lover on it. And like still, like towards the end of this movie, no one decides to like sign this guy's cast. Only the one girl does, that ends up saying loser on it, and then he ends up changing it to lover, which is just like obviously you could tell. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna adjust it to lover. Like he should have just really just like changed the whole thing, the whole lettering of it, to just be like, nah. He could have gotten white out. But yeah, there was this one spot where Eddie was to like go home and like tell his mother that he's gonna leave with his friends, and he has to like kiss his mom before he's to go out. And so there's this one spot where eventually, like when Eddie is to get his cast, we have this girl telling him, it's like, you know what, like that medication that you're on, it's all BS, like it's not even real, and like it's all like placebos or whatever. And so eventually Eddie confronts his mother about it, and like he doesn't say the word placebos, like he says like gazebos. And he chucks him at her like, they're all gazebos, they're all fake, they're all bullshit. And so he ends up tossing it at his mother, and it's like, well, like his mother was just trying to protect him, but maybe like protect him way too much. So oh, there was also when they were trying to get bandages for Ben, they didn't have any money, or they didn't know anybody that would have money. Like they asked Eddie, and Eddie's like, dude, I'm not gonna like if I end up going and charging anything like bandages or whatever on this, my mother's gonna find out, and I'm gonna have to get X-rayed and whatever for the rest of my life. So Beverly goes, and she ends up like creating a distraction for this pharmacist, like kind of mentioning how this guy's glasses make him look like Clark Kent. And Beverly eventually tries on these glasses, and like he ends up saying like, "Oh, you look like Lois Lane." And so these kids end up running off with this, with these bandages or whatever, and like Beverly ends up like taking one thing and like sliding it off. So, uh, but yeah, so back to the whole like Eddie, who is forcibly now having a freaking what is it called? Broken arm. I think Richie ended up like setting the arm to where I'm just like, dude, you shouldn't, like, no, don't set it, because what's gonna end up happening is Eddie's probably going to go to the hospital, and they're like, well, you know what, like this wasn't set properly, and so they would have to re-break the bone, set it properly, and then like, because I've seen that happen, I've heard that happen. Check out the one Markiplier video where he used to talk about like the time that he went on Jungle Gym and broke his arm and had to get it, like, he said it, and the doctor is like, well, hey, yeah, you did a really good job, but like, and then reset it, and then like they did it perfectly to where like, but it hurt like a mother. So I think everyone, like, I thought it was kind of weird. I thought someone would have died during this part of this movie where everybody's kind of like running around in this one abandoned house, but nobody did. Uh, like, it was really cool, the one spot where Eddie's head was to come out of the one, um, like, little mattress that was to be on the ground, and he's like, yeah. But it was like, so we were to all think like, oh, is Eddie dead now? But no, Eddie is fine. He ends up getting like from out of the thing perfectly fine, but with a broken arm. We had Pennywise who's like trying to attack Eddie with his broken arm, and like Eddie's just trying to like bat freaking like Pennywise away with one good arm. And so yeah, eventually they get a one up on Eddie to or Eddie. The kids all eventually get a one up on Pennywise, which just kind of pushes him down this well. And Benny is to go and follow him and realize that, oh, like this must be his home, this must be his spot. And so now that pushes all of the kids to eventually go and decide, okay, now we're going to go down here to go and chase after Pennywise and eventually try to get him now. Which eventually forces Pennywise to have to recruit Henry, and so Henry is to all of a sudden get his blade in his mailbox, and so Henry is to eventually go on into his home after his father had repetitiously shot at him, like outside, because Henry was supposedly uh, cleaning his father's gun because his father is the sheriff of this town. And so this kid is to just like fire away at certain kind of like basically wasting this guy's like ammo, shooting at bottles and eventually almost shooting a cat, weirdly enough, but he doesn't get to it. So eventually Henry is to take this blade next to his father's neck while he's sleeping, probably drunk and whatever. And so Henry ends up like letting go of the blade to stab his father in the neck, and because his TV is telling him to do it, to kill everyone, to kill all, to kill whatever. So that eventually pushes when all the kids all decide to go to the well. We have a kind of Goonies moment where eventually Mike is to bring the weapon that he is to have had from his home or his like uh, like place of work that eventually kills goats and who knows what else. So and eventually Mike goes and is able to do the job after like this whole scenario, just kind of faces fear. So, I'm trying to like remember if I kind of covered like all of like most of the stuff at this point. Um, because eventually Ben is to take all the kids to his house at one point to let him know about the whole backstory of Pennywise, and eventually like Beverly is his spot, because Ben like takes down all these like New Kids on the Block posters that he has and like shoves them all in his little closet, and Beverly ends up seeing the back of Ben's door where it has like the New Kids on the Block thing, and she kind of like and Ben's like come on, like so. Uh, but yeah, that's when Ben like splidoos out like all of the like back history of Pennywise and all the mysterious stuff that he found out about that. Like this guy has this like detective kind of wall, and you would have thought this guy would have became a cop or something, just because he has all these pentagrams, just trying to like figure out where all the history of something happened, and like you would have thought this guy would have became a cop. So pushing on, so these kids all decide, hey, let's go down this well and let's go and grab some like rope so that way we can get down there. So eventually everyone gets down there but Mike, and so all of a sudden we have the rope being retrieved, and so we find out Henry is just beating the crap out of Mike. So eventually what ends up happening is Mike, sadly enough, tosses Henry down this well to die. And so, because like the guys were trying to figure out how they can get back to Mike because they wanted to help him. And we also find out that when Mike eventually goes to like try and like grab his like weapon stuff, he ends up like dropping a bunch of the ammo part down the well to where it's like, yeah, you're not going to get that back. Good job. So evidently they're only going to have one shot at this, so they got to make it good. But like that weapon wasn't going to take down Pennywise anyways, as well as any of the number of the things that they were going to have at like with weapons or whatever that they were going to have. So we forgot about the Beverly stuff. So the main reason why these kids all decide to go down this well whatsoever is because Beverly ends up getting taken by Pennywise. And so, because what ends up happening is Beverly ends up going home, and her father ends up confronting her about the postcard that she had in her underwear drawer, and like also she is to be confronted about hanging out with boys, because eventually Beverly was to be at Eddie's home, and Eddie's mother was to mention how Beverly was just kind of trash, or that like she wants especially Beverly to be nowhere near her son, because she knows how like much of a bad person that supposedly she is because of the possible like connection to her father. So what ends up happening is Beverly ends up getting attacked by her father, which leads to eventually them like tussling into the bathroom, which forces Beverly to push her father against this tub, and I think he ends up getting like knocked out or injured or whatever. But then when eventually Beverly turns to get out of the bathroom, eventually Pennywise is there to grab her and take her down into this spot of this well where she was to basically be like taken and then like shown something to blind her to where she ends up just turning into a statue or a zombie or whatever, that like she just stands there and is like any of the other kids that is just kind of floating around this one spot of this giant pile of trash. But we have this spot where Pennywise is just kind of dancing around doing this whole goofy spot, but eventually we have all the kids making it down the well, and and making it down to where Beverly is. And so eventually they try to wake her up, or they try to like figure out how to be able to help her. So Ben eventually decides that he's going to kiss her, I guess, because any Disney movie will tell you that, oh yeah, kiss the damsel in distress and she'll probably wake up. So Ben kisses her, and all of a sudden Beverly is to find out that Ben was the person who sent her the postcard about the little poem and whatever, and like kind of cementing that either they will end up together or Beverly and Bill would probably end up together. It seems like there was this kind of like love triangle going on there consistently. So, uh, eventually what ends up happening is that eventually Pennywise is to come in there, and so like at one point we had this group almost disband at some point, and Beverly was like, yeah, that's what Pennywise wants. He wants us to be separated so that way he can pick us off one by one. Because Charlie ends up going and is having a fight with the group and just wanting to separate just because he's like, man, I don't want to do this anymore. But eventually they're to like Bill and everybody to just like talk this group back together so that way they can face Pennywise one more time. And so this is when like everybody's